This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit Librivox.org. Recorded by Shanda Williams, Atlanta, Georgia, April 2006. The Three Musketeers by Alexandre Dumas, Chapter 6, His Majesty King Louis XIII. This affair made a great noise. Monsieur de Tréville scolded his Musketeers in public and congratulated them in private. But as no time was to be lost in gaining the king, Monsieur de Tréville hastened to report himself at the Louvre. It was already too late. The king was closeted with the cardinal, and Monsieur de Tréville was informed that the king was busy and could not receive him at that moment. In the evening, Monsieur de Tréville attended the king's gaming table. The king was winning, and as he was very avaricious, he was in an excellent humor. Perceiving Monsieur de Tréville at a distance, "Come here, Monsieur Captain," he said. "Come here, that I may growl at you. Do you know that his Eminence has been making fresh complaints against your Musketeers, and that with so much emotion after this evening his Eminence is indisposed? Ah, these Musketeers of yours are very devils, fellows to be hanged." "No, sire," replied Tréville, who saw at the first glance how things would go. "On the contrary, they are good creatures, as meek as lambs, and have but one desire. I'll be their warranty, and that is that their swords may never leave their scabbards but in your Majesty's service. But what are they to do? The guards of Monsieur the Cardinal are forever seeking quarrels with them, and for the honor of the corps even, the poor young men are obliged to defend themselves." "Listen to Monsieur de Tréville," said the king. "Listen to him. Would not one say he was speaking of a religious community? In truth, my dear captain, I have a great mind to take away your commission and give it to Mademoiselle de Chemerault, to whom I promised an abbey. But don't fancy that I'm going to take you on your bare word. I am called Louis the Just, Monsieur de Tréville, and by and by, we will see." "Ah, sire, it is because I confide in that justice that I shall wait patiently and quietly the good pleasure of your Majesty." "Wait then, monsieur, wait," said the king. "I will not detain you long." In fact, fortune changed, and as the king began to lose what he had won, he was not sorry to find an excuse for playing Charlemagne, if we may use a gaming phrase of whose origin we confess our ignorance. The king therefore arose a minute after, and putting the money which lay before him into his pocket, the major part of which arose from his winnings, "La Vieuville," said he, "take my place. I must speak to Monsieur de Tréville on an affair of importance. Ah, I had 80 louis before me. Put down the same sum, so that they who have lost may have nothing to complain of. Justice before everything." Then turning toward Monsieur de Tréville and walking with him toward the embrasure of a window, "Well, monsieur," continued he, "you say it is his Eminence's guards who have sought a quarrel with your Musketeers?" "Yes, sire, as they always do." "And how did the thing happen? Let us see, for you know, my dear captain, a judge must hear both sides." "Good Lord, in the most simple and natural manner possible. 3 of my best soldiers, whom your Majesty knows by name, and whose devotedness you have more than once appreciated, and who have, I dare affirm to the king, his service much at heart. 3 of my best soldiers, I say, Athos, Porthos, and Aramis, had made a party of pleasure with a young fellow from Gascony, whom I had introduced to them the same morning. The party was to take place at Saint Germain, I believe, and they had appointed to meet at the Carme des Chaux, where they were disturbed by de Jussac, Cahusac, and Bicarat, and 2 other guardsmen, who certainly did not go there in such a numerous company without some ill intention against the edicts." "Ah, ah, you incline me to think so," said the king. "There is no doubt they went thither to fight themselves." "I do not accuse them, sire, but I leave your Majesty to judge what 5 armed men could possibly be going to do in such a deserted place as the neighborhood of the Convent des Carmes." "Yes, you are right, Tréville, you are right." Then, upon seeing my Musketeers, they changed their minds, and forgot their private hatred for partisan hatred, for your Majesty could not be ignorant that the Musketeers, who belong to the king, and nobody but the king, are the natural enemies of the Guardsmen, who belong to the cardinal. "Yes, Tréville, yes," said the king in a melancholy tone. And it is very sad, believe me, to see thus two parties in France, two heads to royalty. But all this will come to an end, Tréville, will come to an end. You say, then, that the Guardsmen sought a quarrel with the Musketeers? I say that it is probable that things have fallen out so, but I will not swear to it, sire. You know how difficult it is to discover the truth, and unless a man be endowed with that admirable instinct which causes Louis XIII. To be named the Just— You are right, Tréville, but they were not alone, your Musketeers. They had a youth with them? Yes, sire, and one wounded man, so that 3 of the king's Musketeers, one of whom was wounded, and a youth, not only maintained their ground against 5 of the most terrible of the cardinal's guardsmen, but absolutely brought 4 of them to earth. "Why, this is a victory!" cried the king, all radiant. "A complete victory!" "Yes, sire, as complete as that as the bridge of Say." 4 men, one of them wounded, and a youth, say you? One hardly a young man, but who, however, behaved himself so admirably on this occasion that I will take the liberty of recommending him to your Majesty. How does he call himself? D'Artagnan, sire. He is the son of one of my oldest friends, the son of a man who served under the king your father, of glorious memory, in the Civil War. And you say this young man behaved himself well? Tell me how, Tréville. You know how I delight in accounts of war and fighting. And Louis XIII. Twisted his mustache proudly, placing his hand upon his hip. "Sire," resumed Tréville, "as I told you, Monsieur d'Artagnan is a little more than a boy, and he has not the honor of being a Musketeer. He was dressed as a citizen. The guards of the cardinal, perceiving his youth and that he did not belong to the corps, invited him to retire before they attacked." "So you may plainly see, Tréville," interrupted the king, "it was they who attacked?" "That is true, sire. There can be no more doubt on that head." "They called upon him then to retire, but he answered that he was a Musketeer at heart, entirely devoted to your Majesty, and that therefore he would remain with Messieurs the Musketeers." "Brave young man!" murmured the king. "Well, he did remain with them, and your Majesty has in him so firm a champion that it was he who gave Jussac the terrible sword thrust which has made the cardinal so angry." "He who wounded Jussac?" cried the king. "He, a boy? Tréville, that is impossible." "It is as I have the honor to relate it to your Majesty. Jussac, one of the first swordsmen in the kingdom? Well, sire, for once he found his master. I will see this young man, Tréville. I will see him, and if anything can be done, well, we will make it our business. When will your Majesty deign to receive him?" "Tomorrow at midday, Tréville." "Shall I bring him alone?" "No, bring me all 4 together. I wish to thank them all at once. Devoted men are so rare, Tréville. By the back of the staircase. It is useless to let the cardinal know." "Yes, sire." "You understand, Tréville, an edict is still an edict. It is forbidden to fight, after all." "But this encounter, sire, is quite out of the ordinary conditions of a duel. It is a brawl, and the proof is that there were 5 of the cardinal's guardsmen against my 3 Musketeers and Monsieur d'Artagnan." "That is true," said the king, "but never mind, Tréville. Come still by the back staircase." Tréville smiled. But as it was indeed something to have prevailed upon this child to rebel against his master, he saluted the king respectfully, and with this agreement took leave of him. That evening the 3 Musketeers were informed of the honor accorded them. As they had long been acquainted with the king, they were not much excited, but D'Artagnan, with his Gascon imagination, saw in it his future fortune, and passed the night in golden dreams. By 8 o'clock in the morning he was at the apartment of Athos. D'Artagnan found the Musketeer dressed and ready to go out. As the hour to wait upon the king was not till 12, he had made a party with Porthos and Aramis to play a game at tennis in a tennis court situated near the stables of Luxembourg. Athos invited D'Artagnan to follow them, and although ignorant of the game, which he had never played, he accepted, not knowing what to do at this time from 9 o'clock in the morning, as it then scarcely was, till 12. The 2 Musketeers were already there, and were playing together. Athos, who was very expert in all bodily exercises, passed with D'Artagnan to the opposite side and challenged them; but at the first effort he made, although he played with his left hand, he found that his wound was yet too recent to allow of such exertion. D'Artagnan remained therefore alone, and as he declared he was too ignorant of the game to play it regularly, they only continued giving balls to one another without counting. But one of these balls, launched by Porthos's Herculean hand, passed so close to D'Artagnan's face that he thought if, instead of passing near, it had hit him, his audience would have been probably lost, as it would have been impossible for him to present himself before the king. Now, as upon this audience and his Gascon imagination depended his future life, he saluted Aramis and Porthos politely, declaring that he would not resume the game until he should be prepared to play with them on more equal terms, and went and took his place near the court and in the gallery. Unfortunately for D'Artagnan, among the spectators was one of his Eminence's guardsmen, who, still irritated by the defeat of his companions, which had happened only the day before, had promised himself to seize the first opportunity of avenging it. He believed this opportunity was now come, and addressed his neighbor. "It is not astonishing that a young man should be afraid of a ball, for he is doubtless a Musketeer apprentice." D'Artagnan turned round as if a serpent had stung him, and fixed his eyes intensely upon the guardsman who had just made this insolent speech. "Pardieu," resumed the latter, twisting his mustache, "look at me as long as you like, my little gentleman. I have said what I have said." "And as since that which you have said is too clear to require an explanation," replied D'Artagnan in a low voice, "I beg you to follow me." "And when?" asked the guardsman, with the same jeering air. "At once, if you please." "And you know who I am, without doubt?" "I? I'm completely ignorant, nor does it much disquiet me." "You're in the wrong there, for if you knew my name, perhaps you would not be so pressing." "What is your name?" "Bernajoux, at your service." "Well, then, Monsieur Bernajoux," said D'Artagnan tranquilly, "I will wait for you at the door." "Go, monsieur, I will follow you." "Do not hurry yourself, monsieur, lest it be observed that we go out together. You must be aware that for our undertaking, company would be in the way." "That's true," said the guardsman, astonished that his name had not produced more effect upon the young man. Indeed, the name of Bernajoux was known to all the world, D'Artagnan alone excepted, perhaps, for it was one of those which figured most frequently in the daily brawls which all the edicts of the cardinal could not repress. Porthos and Aramis were so engaged with their game, and Athos was watching them with so much attention, that they did not even perceive their young companion go out, who, as he had told the guardsman of his Eminence, stopped outside the door. An instant after, the guardsman descended in his turn. As D'Artagnan had no time to lose on account of the audience of the king, which was fixed for midday, he cast his eyes around, and seeing that the street was empty, said to his adversary, "My faith, it is fortunate for you, although your name is Bernajoux, to have only to deal with an apprentice Musketeer. Never mind, be content, I will do my best. On guard!" "But," said he whom D'Artagnan thus provoked, "it appears to me that this place is badly chosen, and that we should be better behind the Abbey Saint-Germain or in the Pré aux Clercs." "What you say is full of sense," replied D'Artagnan, "but unfortunately I have very little time to spare, having an appointment at precisely 12. On guard, then, monsieur, on guard!" Bernajoux was not a man to have such a compliment paid to him twice. In an instant his sword glittered in his hand, and he sprang upon his adversary, whom, thanks to his great youthfulness, he hoped to intimidate. But D'Artagnan had on the preceding day served his apprenticeship. Fresh sharpened by his victory, full of hopes of future favor, he was resolved not to recoil a step. So the two swords were crossed close to the hilts, and as D'Artagnan stood firm, it was his adversary who made the retreating step. But D'Artagnan seized the moment at which, in this movement, the sword of Bernajoux deviated from the line. He freed his weapon, made a lunge, and touched his adversary on the shoulder. D'Artagnan immediately made a step backward and raised his sword, but Bernajoux cried out that it was nothing, and rushing blindly upon him, absolutely spitted himself upon D'Artagnan's sword. As, however, he did not fall, as he did not declare himself conquered, but only broke away toward the hôtel of Monsieur de la Trémouille, in whose service he had a relative, D'Artagnan was ignorant of the seriousness of the last wound his adversary had received, and pressing him warmly, without doubt, would soon have completed his work with a third blow, when the noise which arose from the street being heard in the tennis court, two of the friends of the Guardsman who had seen him go out after exchanging some words with D'Artagnan rushed, sword in hand, from the court and fell upon the conqueror. But Athos, Porthos, and Aramis quickly appeared in their turn, and the moment the two Guardsmen attacked their young companion, drove them back. Bernajoux now fell, and as the Guardsmen were only 2 against 4, they began to cry, "To the rescue! The Hôtel de la Trémouille!" At these cries, all who were in the hôtel rushed out and fell upon the 4 companions, who, on their side, cried aloud, "To the rescue, Musketeers!" This cry was generally heeded, for the Musketeers were known to be enemies of the cardinal, and were beloved on account of the hatred they bore to his Eminence. Thus the soldiers of other companies than those which belonged to the Red Duke, as Aramis had called him, often took part with the king's Musketeers in these quarrels. Of 3 guardsmen of the company of Monsieur Dessessart who were passing, 2 came to the assistance of the 4 companions, while the other ran toward the hôtel of Monsieur de Tréville, crying, "To the rescue, Musketeers, to the rescue!" As usual, the hôtel was full of soldiers of this company, who hastened to the succor of their comrades. The melee became general, but strength was on the side of the Musketeers. The cardinal's guards and Monsieur de la Trémouille's people retreated into the hôtel, the doors of which they closed just in time to prevent their enemies from entering with them. As to the wounded man, he had been taken in at once, and as we have said, in a very bad state. Excitement was at its height among the Musketeers and their allies, and they even began to deliberate whether they should not set fire to the hôtel to punish the insolence of Monsieur de la Trémouille's domestics in daring to make a sortie upon the king's Musketeers. The proposition had been made and received with enthusiasm, when unfortunately 11 o'clock struck. D'Artagnan and his companions remembered their audience, and as they would very much have regretted that such an opportunity should be lost, they succeeded in calming their friends, who contented themselves with hurling some paving stones against the gates. But the gates were too strong. They soon tired of the sport. Besides, those who must be considered the leaders of the enterprise had quit the group and were making their way toward the hôtel of Monsieur de Tréville, who was waiting for them, already informed of this fresh disturbance. "Quick to the Louvre," said he, "to the Louvre without losing an instant, and let us endeavor to see the king before he is prejudiced by the cardinal. We will describe the thing to him as a consequence of the affair of yesterday, and the 2 will pass off together." Monsieur de Tréville, accompanied by the 4 young fellows, directed his course toward the Louvre, but to the great astonishment of the captain of the Musketeers, he was informed that the king had gone stag hunting in the forest of Saint-Germain. Monsieur de Tréville required this intelligence to be repeated to him twice, and each time his companion saw his brow become darker. "Had his Majesty," asked he, "any intention of holding this hunting party yesterday?" "No, your Excellency," replied the valet de chambre. "The master of the hounds came this morning to inform him that he had marked down a stag. At first the king answered that he would not go, but he could not resist his love of sport, and set out after dinner." "And the king has seen the cardinal?" asked Monsieur de Tréville. "In all probability he has," replied the valet, "for I saw the horses harnessed to his Eminence's carriage this morning, and when I asked where he was going, they told me, to Saint-Germain." "He is beforehand with us," said Monsieur de Tréville. "Gentlemen, I will see the king this evening, but as to you, I do not advise you to risk doing so." This advice was too reasonable, and moreover came from a man who knew the king too well to allow the 4 young men to dispute it. Monsieur de Tréville recommended everyone to return home and wait for news. On entering his hôtel, Monsieur de Tréville thought it best to be first in making the complaint. He sent one of his servants to Monsieur de la Trémouille with a letter in which he begged of him to eject the cardinal's guardsmen from his house, and to reprimand his people for their audacity in making sortie against the king's Musketeers. But Monsieur de la Trémouille, already prejudiced by his esquire, whose relative, as we already know, Bernajoux was, replied that it was neither for Monsieur de Tréville nor the Musketeers to complain, but on the contrary for him, whose people the Musketeers had assaulted and whose hôtel they had endeavored to burn. Now, as the debate between these two nobles might last a long time, each becoming naturally more firm in his own opinion, Monsieur de Tréville thought of an expedient which might terminate it quietly. This was to go himself to Monsieur de la Trémouille. He repaired, therefore, immediately to his hôtel and caused himself to be announced. The two nobles saluted each other politely, for if no friendship existed between them, there was at least esteem. Both were men of courage and honor, and as Monsieur de la Trémouille, a Protestant, and seeing the king seldom, was of no party, he did not in general carry any bias into his social relations. This time, however, his address, although polite, was cooler than usual. "Monsieur," said Monsieur de Tréville, "we fancy that we have each cause to complain of the other, and I am come to endeavor to clear up this affair." "I have no objection," replied Monsieur de la Trémouille, "but I warn you that I am well informed, and all the fault is with your Musketeers." "You are too just and reasonable a man, Monsieur," said Tréville, "not to accept the proposal I am about to make to you." "Make it, Monsieur, I listen." "How is Monsieur Bernajoux, your esquire's relative?" "Why, Monsieur, very ill indeed. In addition to the sword thrust in his arm, which is not dangerous, he has received another right through his lungs, of which the doctor says bad things. But the wounded man retained his senses?" "Perfectly." "Does he talk?" "With difficulty, but he can speak." "Well, Monsieur, let us go to him. Let us adjure him, in the name of the God before whom he must perhaps appear, to speak the truth. I will take him for judge in his own cause, Monsieur, and will believe what he will say." Monsieur de la Trémouille reflected for an instant. Then, as it was difficult to suggest a more reasonable proposal, he agreed to it. Both descended to the chamber in which the wounded man lay. The latter, on seeing these two noble lords who came to visit him, endeavored to raise himself up in his bed, but he was too weak, and exhausted by the effort, he fell back again almost senseless. Monsieur de la Trémouille approached him and made him inhale some salts which recalled him to life. Then Monsieur de Tréville, unwilling that it should be thought that he had influenced the wounded man, requested Monsieur de la Trémouille to interrogate him himself. That happened which Monsieur de Tréville had foreseen. Placed between life and death as Bernajoux was, he had no idea for a moment of concealing the truth, and he described to the two nobles the affair exactly as it had passed. This was all that Monsieur de Tréville wanted. He wished Bernajoux a speedy convalescence, took leave of Monsieur de la Trémouille, returned to his hôtel, and immediately sent word to the four friends that he awaited their company at dinner. Monsieur de Tréville entertained good company, wholly anti-cardinalist though. It may be easily understood, therefore, that the conversation during the whole of dinner turned upon the two checks that his Eminence's guardsmen had received. Now, as D'Artagnan had been the hero of these two fights, it was upon him that all felicitations fell, which Athos, Porthos, and Aramis abandoned to him, not only as good comrades, but as men who had so often had their turn that they could very well afford him his. Toward 6 o'clock, Monsieur de Tréville announced that it was time to go to the Louvre, but as the hour of the audience granted by his Majesty was past, instead of claiming the entry by the back stairs, he placed himself with the four young men in the antechamber. The king had not yet returned from hunting. Our young men had been waiting about half an hour amid a crowd of courtiers, when all the doors were thrown open and his Majesty was announced. At his announcement, D'Artagnan felt himself tremble to the very marrow of his bones. The coming instant would in all probability decide the rest of his life. His eyes therefore were fixed in a sort of agony upon the door through which the king must enter. Louis XIII. Appeared walking fast. He was in hunting costume, covered with dust, wearing large boots, and holding a whip in his hand. At the first glance, D'Artagnan judged that the mind of the king was stormy. This disposition, visible as it was in his Majesty, did not prevent the courtiers from ranging themselves along his pathway. In royal antechambers, it is worth more to be viewed with an angry eye than not to be seen at all. The three Musketeers therefore did not hesitate to make a step forward. D'Artagnan, on the contrary, remained concealed behind them; but although the king knew Athos, Porthos, and Aramis personally, he passed before them without speaking, or looking, indeed, as if he had ever seen them before. As for M. de Tréville, when the eyes of the king fell upon him, he sustained the look with so much firmness that it was the king who dropped his eyes, after which his Majesty, grumbling, entered his apartment. "Matters go but badly," said Athos, smiling, "and we shall not be made chevaliers of the order this time." "Wait here 10 minutes," said M. de Tréville, "and if at the expiration of 10 minutes you do not see me come out, return to my hôtel, for it will be useless for you to wait for me longer." The four young men waited 10 minutes, a quarter of an hour, 20 minutes, and seeing that M. de Tréville did not return, went away very uneasy as to what was going to happen. M. de Tréville entered the king's cabinet boldly, and found his Majesty in a very ill humor, seated on an armchair, beating his boot with the handle of his whip. This, however, did not prevent his asking, with the greatest coolness, after his Majesty's health. "Bad, monsieur, bad," replied the king. "I am bored." This was, in fact, the worst complaint of Louis XIII., who would sometimes take one of his courtiers to a window and say, "Monsieur So-and-so, let us weary ourselves together." "How? Your Majesty is bored? Have you not enjoyed the pleasures of the chase today?" "A fine pleasure indeed, monsieur. Upon my soul, everything degenerates, and I don't know whether it is the game which leaves no scent, or the dogs that have no noses. We started a stag of 10 branches. We chased him for 6 hours, and when he was near being taken, when Saint Simon was already putting his horn to his mouth to sound the mort, crack! All the pack takes the wrong scent and sets off after a 2-year-older. I shall be obliged to give up hunting, as I have given up hawking. Ah, I am an unfortunate king, M. de Tréville. I had but one gerfalcon, and he died day before yesterday." "Indeed, sire, I wholly comprehend your disappointment. The misfortune is great, but I think you still have a good number of falcons, sparrowhawks, and tiercels." "And not a man to instruct them. Falconers are declining. I know no one but myself who is acquainted with the noble art of venery. After me it will all be over, and people will hunt with gins, snares, and traps. If I had but the time to train pupils! But there is the cardinal, always at hand, who does not leave me a moment's repose, who talks to me about Spain, who talks to me about Austria, who talks to me about England. Ah, apropos of the cardinal, M. de Tréville, I am vexed with you." This was the chance at which M. de Tréville waited for the king. He knew the king of old, and he knew that all these complaints were but a preface, a sort of excitation to encourage himself, and that he had now come to his point at last. "And in what have I been so unfortunate as to displease your Majesty?" asked M. de Tréville, feigning the most profound astonishment. "Is it thus you perform your charge, monsieur?" continued the king, without directly replying to de Tréville's question. "Is it for this I name you captain of my Musketeers, that they should assassinate a man, disturb a whole quarter, and endeavor to set fire to Paris without your saying a word? But yet," continued the king, "undoubtedly my haste accuses you wrongfully. Without doubt the rioters are in prison, and you come to tell me justice is done." "Sire," replied M. de Tréville calmly, "on the contrary, I come to demand it of you." "And against whom?" cried the king. "Against calumniators," said M. de Tréville. "Ah, this is something new," replied the king. "Will you tell me that your 3 damned Musketeers, Athos, Porthos, and Aramis, and your youngster from Béarn, have not fallen, like so many furies, upon poor Bernajoux, and have not maltreated him in such a fashion that probably by this time he is dead? Will you tell me that they did not lay siege to the hôtel of Duc de la Trémouille, and that they did not endeavor to burn it, which would not, perhaps, have been a great misfortune in time of war, seeing that it is nothing but a nest of Huguenots, but which is, in time of peace, a frightful example? Tell me now, can you deny all this?" "And who told you this fine story, sire?" asked Tréville quietly. "Who has told me this fine story, monsieur? Who should it be but he who watches while I sleep, who labors while I amuse myself, who conducts everything at home and abroad, in France as in Europe?" "Your Majesty probably refers to God," said M. de Tréville, "for I know no one except God who can be so far above your Majesty." No, monsieur, I speak of the prop of the state, of my only servant, of my only friend, of the cardinal." "His Eminence is not his Holiness, sire." "What do you mean by that, monsieur?" "That it is only the Pope who is infallible, and that this infallibility does not extend to cardinals." "You mean to say that he deceives me? You mean to say that he betrays me? You accuse him, then? Come, speak, avow freely that you accuse him." "No, sire, but I say that he deceives himself. I say that he is ill-informed. I say that he has hastily accused your Majesty's Musketeers, toward whom he is unjust, and that he has not obtained his information from good sources." "The accusation comes from Monsieur de la Trémouille, from the Duke himself. What do you say to that?" "I might answer, sire, that he is too deeply interested in the question to be a very impartial witness. But so far from that, sire, I know the Duke to be a royal gentleman, and I refer the matter to him, but upon one condition, sire." "What?" "It is that your Majesty will make him come here, will interrogate him yourself, tête-à-tête, without witnesses, and that I shall see your Majesty as soon as you have seen the Duke." "What, then? You will bind yourself," cried the king, "by what Monsieur de la Trémouille shall say?" "Yes, sire." "You will accept his judgment?" "Undoubtedly." "And you will submit to the reparation he may require?" "Certainly." "La Chesnaye," said the king, "La Chesnaye." Louis XIII's confidential valet, who never left the door, entered in reply to the call. "La Chesnaye," said the king, "let someone go instantly and find Monsieur de la Trémouille. I wish to speak with him this evening." "Your Majesty gives me your word that you will not see anyone between Monsieur de la Trémouille and myself?" "Nobody, by the faith of a gentleman." "Tomorrow, then, sire?" "Tomorrow, monsieur." "At what o'clock, please your Majesty?" "At any hour you will." "But in coming too early, I should be afraid of awakening your Majesty." "Awaken me? Do you think I ever sleep, then?" "I sleep no longer, monsieur. I sometimes dream, that's all." "Come, then, as early as you like, at 7 o'clock. But beware if you and your Musketeers are guilty." "If my Musketeers are guilty, sire, the guilty shall be placed in your Majesty's hands, who will dispose of them at your good pleasure. Does your Majesty require anything further? Speak, I am ready to obey." "No, monsieur, no. I am not called Louis the Just without reason. Tomorrow, then, monsieur, tomorrow." "Till then, God preserve your Majesty." However ill the king might sleep, Monsieur de Tréville slept still worse. He had ordered his 3 Musketeers and their companion to be with him at 6:30 in the morning. He took them with him without encouraging them or promising them anything, and without concealing from them that their luck, and even his own, depended upon the cast of the dice. Arrived at the front of the back stairs, he desired them to wait. If the king was still irritated against them, they would depart without being seen. If the king consented to see them, they would only have to be called. On arriving at the king's private antechamber, Monsieur de Tréville found La Chesnaye, who informed him that they had not been able to find Monsieur de la Trémouille on the preceding evening at his hôtel, that he returned too late to present himself at the Louvre, that he had only that moment arrived, and that he was at that very hour with the king. This circumstance pleased Monsieur de Tréville much, as he thus became certain that no foreign suggestion could insinuate itself between Monsieur de la Trémouille's testimony and himself. In fact, 10 minutes had scarcely passed away when the door of the king's closet opened, and Monsieur de Tréville saw Monsieur de la Trémouille come out. The duke came straight up to him and said, "Monsieur de Tréville, His Majesty has just sent for me in order to inquire respecting the circumstances which took place yesterday at my hôtel. I have told him the truth, that is to say, that the fault lay with my people, and that I was ready to offer you my excuses. Since I have the good fortune to meet you, I beg you to receive them, and to hold me always as one of your friends." "Monsieur the Duke," said Monsieur de Tréville, "I was so confident of your loyalty that I required no other defender before His Majesty than yourself. I find that I have not been mistaken, and I thank you that there is still one man in France of whom may be said, without disappointment, what I have said of you." "That's well said," cried the king, who had heard all these compliments through the open door. "Only tell him, Tréville, since he wishes to be considered your friend, that I also wish to be one of his, but he neglects me. That it is Nearly 3 years since I have seen him, and that I never do see him unless I send for him. Tell him all this for me, for these are things which a king cannot say for himself." "Thanks, sire, thanks," said the duke. "But your Majesty may be assured that it is not those—I do not speak of Monsieur de Tréville—whom your Majesty sees at all hours of the day that are most devoted to you." "Ah, you have heard what I said. So much the better, Duke, so much the better," said the king, advancing toward the door. "Ah, it is you, Tréville? Where are your Musketeers? I told you the day before yesterday to bring them with you. Why have you not done so?" "They are below, sire, and with your permission La Chesnaye will bid them come up." "Yes, yes, let them come up immediately. It is nearly 8 o'clock, and at 9 I expect a visit. Go, Monsieur Duke, and return often. Come in, Tréville." The duke saluted and retired. At the moment he opened the door, the three Musketeers and D'Artagnan, conducted by La Chesnaye, appeared at the top of the staircase. "Come in, my braves," said the king. "Come in, I am going to scold you." The Musketeers advanced, bowing, D'Artagnan following closely behind them. "What the devil!" continued the king. "7 of his Eminence's Guards placed hors de combat by you 4 in 2 days. That's too many, gentlemen, too many. If you go on so, his Eminence will be forced to renew his company in 3 weeks, and I to put the edicts in force in all their rigor. One now and then I don't say too much about, but 7 in 2 days? I repeat, it is too many, it is far too many. Therefore, sire, your Majesty sees that they are come, quite contrite and repentant, to offer you their excuses." "Quite contrite and repentant? Said the king. "I place no confidence in their hypocritical faces. In particular, there is one yonder of a Gascon look. Come hither, monsieur." D'Artagnan, who understood that it was to him this compliment was addressed, approached, assuming a most deprecating air. "Why, you told me he was a young man. This is a boy, Tréville, a mere boy. Do you mean to say that it was he who bestowed that severe thrust at Jussac, and those 2 equally fine thrusts at Bernajoux?" "Truly." "Without reckoning," said Athos, "that if he had not rescued me from the hands of Cahusac, I should not now have the honor of making my very humble reverence to your Majesty." "Why, he is a very devil, this Bernay. Ventre saint gris, Monsieur de Tréville, as the king my father would have said. But at this sort of work, many doublets must be slashed and many swords broken. Now, Gascons are always poor, are they not?" "Sire, I can assert that they have hitherto discovered no gold mines in their mountains, though the Lord owes them this miracle in recompense for the manner in which they supported the pretensions of the king your father. Which is to say that the Gascons made a king of me, myself, seeing that I am my father's son, is it not, Tréville? Well, happily, I don't say nay to it. La Chesnaye, go and see if by rummaging all my pockets you can find 40 pistoles, and if you can find them, bring them to me. And now let us see, young man, with your hand upon your conscience, how did all this come to pass?" D'Artagnan related the adventure of the preceding day in all its details. How, not having been able to sleep for the joy he felt in the expectation of seeing his Majesty, he had gone to his 3 friends 3 hours before the hour of audience, how they had gone together to the tennis court, and how upon the fear he had manifested lest he receive a ball in the face, he had been jeered at by Bernajoux, who had nearly paid for his jeer with his life, and Monsieur de la Trémouille, who had nothing to do with the matter, with the loss of his hotel. "This is all very well," murmured the king. "Yes, this is just the account the duke gave me of the affair. Poor cardinal, 7 men in 2 days, and those of his very best! But that's quite enough, gentlemen, please to understand. That's enough. You have taken your revenge for the Rue Férou, and even exceeded it. You ought to be satisfied." "If your Majesty is so," said Tréville, "we are." "Oh, yes, I am," added the king, taking a handful of gold from La Chesnaye and putting it into the hand of D'Artagnan. "Here," said he, "is a proof of my satisfaction." At this epoch, the ideas of pride which are in fashion in our days did not prevail. A gentleman received from hand to hand money from the king, and was not the least in the world humiliated. D'Artagnan put his 40 pistoles into his pocket without any scruple, on the contrary, thanking his Majesty greatly. "There," said the king, looking at a clock. "There now, as it is 8:30, you may retire, for as I told you, I expect someone at 9. Thanks for your devotedness, gentlemen. I may continue to rely upon it, may I not?" "Oh, sire!" cried the four companions with one voice, "we would allow ourselves to be cut to pieces in your Majesty's service." "Well, well, but keep whole, that will be better, and you will be as more useful to me. Tréville," added the king in a low voice, as the others were retiring, "as you have no room in the Musketeers, and as we have besides decided that a novitiate is necessary before entering that corps, place this young man in the company of the guards of Monsieur Dessessart, your brother-in-law. Ah, pardieu, Tréville, I enjoy beforehand the face of the cardinal will make. He will be furious, but I don't care. I am doing what is right." The king waved his hand to Tréville, who left him and rejoined the Musketeers, whom he found sharing the 40 pistoles with D'Artagnan. The cardinal, as his Majesty had said, was really furious, so furious that during 8 days he absented himself from the king's gaming table. This did not prevent the king from being as complaisant to him as possible whenever he met him, or from asking in the kindest tone, "Well, Monsieur Cardinal, how fares it with the poor Jussac and that poor Bernajoux of yours?" End of chapter 6.
This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Kevin Kivico. The Three Musketeers by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 7. The Interior of the Musketeers. When D'Artagnan was out of the Louvre, and consulted his friends upon the use he had best make of his share of the 40 pistoles, Athos advised him to order a good repast at the Pomme de Pin, Porthos to engage a lackey, and Aramis to provide himself with a suitable mistress. The repast was carried into effect that very day, and the lackey waited at table. The repast had been ordered by Athos, and the lackey furnished by Porthos. He was a Picard, whom the glorious Musketeer had picked up at the Bridge Tournelle, making rings and plashing in the water. Porthos pretended that this occupation was proof of a reflective and contemplative organization, and he had brought him away without any other recommendation. The noble carriage of this gentleman, for whom he believed himself to be engaged, had won Planchet. That was the name of the Picard. He felt a slight disappointment, however, when he saw that this place was already taken by a compeer named Mousqueton, and when Porthos signified to him that the state of his household, though great, would not support 2 servants, and that he must enter into the service of D'Artagnan. Nevertheless, when he waited at the dinner given by his master and saw him take out a handful of gold to pay for it, he believed his fortune made, and returned thanks to heaven for having thrown him into the service of such a Croesus. He preserved this opinion even after the feast, with the remnants of which he repaired his own long abstinence. But when in the evening he made his master's bed, the chimeras of Planchet faded away. The bed was the only one in the apartment, which consisted of an antechamber and a bedroom. Planchet slept in the antechamber, upon a coverlet taken from the bed of D'Artagnan, and which D'Artagnan from that time made shift to do without. Athos, on his part, had a valet whom he had trained in his service in a thoroughly peculiar fashion, and who was named Grimaud. He was very taciturn, this worthy signor. Be it understood, we are speaking of Athos. During the 5 or 6 years that he had lived in the strictest intimacy with his companions, Porthos and Aramis, they could remember having often seen him smile, but had never heard him laugh. His words were brief and expressive, conveying all that was meant and no more. No embellishments, no embroidery, no arabesques. His conversation a matter of fact, without a single romance. Although Athos was scarcely 30 years old, and was of great personal beauty and intelligence of mind, no one knew whether he had ever had a mistress. He had never spoken of women. He certainly did not prevent others from speaking of them before him, although it was easy to perceive that this kind of conversation, in which he only mingled by bitter words and misanthropic remarks, was very disagreeable to him. His reserve, his roughness, and his silence made almost an old man of him. He had, then, in order not to disturb his habits, accustomed Grimaud to obey him upon a simple gesture or upon a simple movement of his lips. He never spoke to him, except under the most extraordinary occasions. Sometimes Grimaud, who feared his master as he did fire, while entertaining a strong attachment to his person and a great veneration for his talents, believed he perfectly understood what he wanted, flew to execute the order received, and did precisely the contrary. Athos then shrugged his shoulders, and without putting himself in a passion, thrashed Grimaud. On these days he spoke a little. Porthos, as we have seen, had a character exactly opposite to that of Athos. He not only talked much, but he talked loudly, little caring, we must render him that justice, whether anybody listened to him or not. He talked for the pleasure of talking, and for the pleasure of hearing himself talk. He spoke upon all subjects except the sciences, alleging in this respect the inveterate hatred he had borne to scholars from his childhood. He had not so noble an air as Athos, and the commencement of their intimacy often rendered him unjust toward that gentleman, whom he endeavored to eclipse by his splendid dress. But with his simple Musketeer's uniform, and nothing but the manner in which he threw back his head and advanced his foot, Athos instantly took the place which was his due, and consigned the ostentatious Porthos to the second rank. Porthos consoled himself by filling the antechamber of Monsieur de Troisville and the guardroom of the Louvre with the accounts of his love scrapes, after having passed from professional ladies to military ladies, from the lawyer's dame to the baroness. There was question of nothing less with Porthos than a foreign princess, who was enormously fond of him. An old proverb says, "Like master, like man." Let us pass, then, from the valet of Athos to the valet of Porthos, from Grimaud to Mousqueton. Mousqueton was a Norman, whose pacific name of Boniface his master had changed into the infinitely more sonorous name of Mousqueton. He had entered the service of Porthos upon condition that he should only be clothed and lodged, though in a handsome manner, but he claimed 2 hours a day to himself, consecrated to an employment which would provide for his other wants. Porthos agreed to the bargain. The thing suited him wonderfully well. He had doublets cut out of his old clothes and cast-off cloaks for Mousqueton, and thanks to a very intelligent tailor who made his clothes look as good as new by turning them, and whose wife was suspected of wishing to make Porthos descend from his aristocratic habits, Mousqueton made a very good figure when attending on his master. As for Aramis, of whom we believe we have sufficiently explained the character, a character which, like that of his lackey, was called Bazin. Thanks to the hopes which his master entertained of some day entering into orders, he was always clothed in black, as became the servant of a churchman. He was a Berrichon, 35 or 40 years old, mild, peaceable, sleek, employing the leisure his master left him in the perusal of pious works, providing rigorously for two a dinner of few dishes, but excellent. For the rest, he was dumb, blind, and deaf, and of unimpeachable fidelity. And now that we are acquainted, superficially at least, with the masters and the valets, let us pass on to the dwellings occupied by each of them. Athos dwelt in the Rue Férou, within 2 steps of the Luxembourg. His apartment consisted of 2 small chambers, very nicely fitted up, in a furnished house, the hostess of which, still young and still really handsome, cast tender glances uselessly at him. Some fragments of past splendor appeared here and there upon the walls of this modest lodging. A sword, for example, richly embossed, which belonged by its make to the times of Francis I, the hilt of which alone, encrusted with precious stones, might be worth 200 pistoles, and which, nevertheless, in his moments of greatest distress, Athos had never pledged or offered for sale. It had long been an object of ambition for Porthos. Porthos would have given 10 years of his life to possess this sword. One day, when he had an appointment with the Duchess, he endeavored even to borrow it of Athos. Athos, without saying anything, emptied his pockets, got together all his jewels, purses, aiguillettes, and gold chains, and offered them all to Porthos. But as to the sword, he said it was sealed to its place and should never quit it, until its master should call himself quit his lodgings. In addition to the sword, there was a portrait representing a nobleman of the time of Henry III, dressed with the greatest elegance, and who wore the Order of the Holy Ghost. And this portrait had certain resemblances of lines with Athos, certain family likenesses which indicated that this great noble, a knight of the Order of the King, was his ancestor. Besides these, a casket of magnificent gold work, with the same arms as the sword and the portrait, formed a middle ornament to the mantelpiece, and assorted badly with the rest of the furniture. Athos always carried the key of this coffer about him. But he one day opened it before Porthos, and Porthos was convinced that this coffer contained nothing but letters and papers, love letters and family papers, no doubt. Porthos lived in an apartment large in size and of very sumptuous appearance, in the Rue du Vieux Colombier. Every time he passed with a friend before his windows, at one of which Mousqueton was sure to be placed in full livery, Porthos raised his head and his hand and said, "That is my abode." But he was never to be found at home. He never invited anybody to go up with him, and no one could form an idea of what his sumptuous apartment contained in the shape of real riches. As to Aramis, he dwelt in a little lodging composed of a boudoir, an eating-room, and a bedroom, which room, situated as the others were on the ground floor, looked out upon a little fresh green garden, shady and impenetrable to the eyes of his neighbors. With regard to D'Artagnan, we know how he was lodged, and we have already made acquaintance with his lackey, Master Planchet. D'Artagnan, who was by nature very curious, as people generally are who possess the genius of intrigue, did all he could to make out who Athos, Porthos, and Aramis really were. For under these pseudonyms, each of these young men concealed his family name, Athos in particular, who, a league away, savored of nobility. He addressed himself then to Porthos to gain information respecting Athos and Aramis, and to Aramis in order to learn something of Porthos. Unfortunately, Porthos knew nothing of the life of his silent companion but what revealed itself. It was said Athos had met with great crosses in love, and that a frightful treachery had forever poisoned the life of this gallant man. What could this treachery be? All the world was ignorant of it. As to Porthos, except his real name, as was the case with those of his two comrades, his life was very easily known. Vain and indiscreet, it was as easy to see through him as through a crystal. The only thing to mislead the investigator would have been belief in all the good things he said of himself. With respect to Aramis, though having the air of having nothing secret about him, he was a young fellow made up of mysteries, answering little to questions put to him about others, and having learned from him the report which prevailed concerning the success of the Musketeer with a princess, wished to gain a little insight into the amorous adventures of his interlocutor. "And you, my dear companion," said he, "you speak of the baronesses, countesses, and princesses of others?" "Pardieu, I spoke of them because Porthos talked of them himself, because he had paraded all these fine things before me. But be assured, my dear Monsieur d'Artagnan, that if I had obtained them from any other source, or if they had been confided to me, there exists no confessor more discreet than myself." "Oh, I don't doubt that," replied D'Artagnan. "But it seems to me that you are terribly familiar with coats of arms. A certain embroidered handkerchief, for instance, to which I owe the honor of your acquaintance." This time Aramis was not angry, but assumed the most modest air, and replied in a friendly tone, "My dear friend, Do not forget that I wish to belong to the church, and that I avoid all mundane opportunities. The handkerchief you saw had not been given to me, but it had been forgotten and left at my house by one of my friends. I was obliged to pick it up in order not to compromise him and the lady he loves. As for myself, I neither have nor desire to have a mistress, following in that respect the very judicious example of Athos, who has none any more than I have." "But what the devil! You are not a priest, you are a Musketeer." "A Musketeer for a time, my friend, as the cardinal says, a Musketeer against my will, but a churchman at heart, believe me. Athos and Porthos dragged me into this to occupy me. I had, at the moment of being ordained, a little difficulty with... But that would not interest you, and I am taking up your valuable time." "Oh, not at all. It interests me very much," cried D'Artagnan, "and at this moment I have absolutely nothing to do." "Yes, but I have my breviary to repeat," answered Aramis. "Then some verses to compose, which Madame d'Aiguillon begged of me. Then I must go to Rue Saint-Honoré in order to purchase some rouge for Madame de Chevreuse. So you see, my dear friend, that if you are not in a hurry, I am very much in a hurry." Aramis held out his hand in a cordial manner to his young companion, and took leave of him. Notwithstanding all the pains he took, D'Artagnan was unable to learn any more concerning his three new-made friends. He formed, therefore, the resolution of believing for the present all that was said of their past, hoping for more certain and extended revelations in the future. In the meanwhile, he looked upon Athos as an Achilles, Porthos as an Ajax, and Aramis as a Joseph. As to the rest, the life of the four young friends was joyous enough. Athos played, and that as a rule, unfortunately. Nevertheless, he never borrowed a sou of his companions, although his purse was ever at their service. And when he had played upon honor, he always awakened his creditor by 6 o'clock the next morning to pay his debt of the preceding evening. Porthos had his fits. On the days when he won, he was insolent and ostentatious. If he lost, he disappeared completely for several days, after which he reappeared with a pale face and thinner person, but with money in his purse. As to Aramis, he never played. He was the worst Musketeer and the most unconvivial companion imaginable. He had always something or other to do, sometimes in the midst of dinner, when everyone, under the attraction of wine and in the warmth of conversation, believed they had 2 or 3 hours longer to enjoy themselves at table. Aramis looked at his watch, arose with a bland smile, and took leave of the company to go, as he said, to consult a casuist with whom he had an appointment. At other times he would return home to write a treatise, and requested his friends not to disturb him. At this Athos would smile with his charming, melancholy smile, which so became his noble countenance, and Porthos would drink, swearing that Aramis would never be anything but a village cure. Planchet, D'Artagnan's valet, supported his good fortune nobly. He received 30 sous per day, and for a month he returned to his lodgings, gay as a chaffinch, and affable toward his master. When the wind of adversity began to blow upon the housekeeping of the Rue des Fossoyeurs, that is to say, when the 40 pistoles of King Louis XIII were consumed, or nearly so, he commenced complaints which Athos thought nauseous, Porthos indecent, and Aramis ridiculous. Athos counseled D'Artagnan to dismiss the fellow. Porthos was of the opinion that he should give him a good thrashing first, and Aramis contended that a master should never attend to anything but the civilities paid to him. "This is all very easy for you to say," replied D'Artagnan, "for you, Athos, who live like a dumb man with Grimaud, who forbid him to speak, and consequently never exchange ill words with him; for you, Porthos, who carry matters in such a magnificent style, and are a god to your valet, Mousqueton; and for you, Aramis, who, always abstracted by your theological studies, inspire your servant Bazin, a mild, religious man with a profound respect. But for me, who am without any settled means and without resources, for me, who am neither a musketeer nor even a guardsman, what am I to do to inspire either the affection, the terror, or the respect in Planchet?" "This is serious," answered the three friends. "It is a family affair. It is with valets as with wives. They must be placed at once upon the footing in which you wish them to remain. Reflect upon it." D'Artagnan did reflect, and resolved to thrash Planchet provisionally, which he did with the conscientiousness that D'Artagnan carried into everything. After having well beaten him, he forbade him to leave his service without his permission. "For," added he, "the future cannot fail to mend. I inevitably look for better times. Your fortune is therefore made if you remain with me, and I am too good a master to allow you to miss such a chance by granting you the dismissal you require." This manner of acting roused much respect for D'Artagnan's policy among the Musketeers. Planchet was equally seized with admiration, and said no more about going away. The life of the four young men had become fraternal. D'Artagnan, who had no settled habits of his own, as he came from his province into the midst of his world quite new to him, fell easily into the habits of his friends. They rose about 8 o'clock in the winter, about 6 in the summer, and went to take the countersign and see how things went on at Monsieur de Tréville's. D'Artagnan, although he was not a musketeer, performed the duty of one with remarkable punctuality. He went on guard because he always kept company with whoever of his friends was on duty. He was well known at the Hotel of the Musketeers, where everyone considered him a good comrade. Monsieur de Tréville, who had appreciated him at the first glance and who bore him a real affection, never ceased recommending him to the king. On their side, the three Musketeers were much attached to their young comrade. The friendship which united these four men, and the need they felt of seeing another 3 or 4 times a day, whether for dueling, business, or pleasure, caused them to be continually running after one another like shadows, and the inseparables were constantly to be met with seeking one another. From the Luxembourg to the Place Saint-Sulpice, or from the Rue de Vieux-Colombier to the Luxembourg. In the meanwhile, the promises of Monsieur de Tréville went on prosperously. One fine morning the king commanded Monsieur de Chevalier Dessessart to admit D'Artagnan as a cadet in his company of guards. D'Artagnan, with a sigh, donned his uniform, which he would have exchanged for that of a musketeer at the expense of 10 years of his existence. But Monsieur de Tréville promised this favor after a novitiate of 2 years, a novitiate which might besides be abridged if an opportunity should present itself for D'Artagnan to render the king any signal service or to distinguish himself by some brilliant action. Upon this promise D'Artagnan withdrew, and the next day he began his service. Then it became the turn of Athos, Porthos, and Aramis to mount guard with D'Artagnan when he was on duty. The company of Monsieur le Chevalier Dessessart thus received 4 instead of 1 when it admitted D'Artagnan.
Chapter 8 of the Three Musketeers. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. The Three Musketeers by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 8. Concerning a court intrigue. In the meantime, the 40 pistoles of King Louis XIII, like all other things of this world, after having had a beginning, had an end, and after this end our 4 companions began to be somewhat embarrassed. At first Athos supported the association for a time with his own means. Porthos succeeded him, and thanks to one of those disappearances to which he was accustomed, he was able to provide for the wants of all for a fortnight. At last it became Aramis's turn, who performed it with a good grace, and who succeeded, as he said, by selling some theological books, in procuring a few pistoles. Then, as they had been accustomed to do, they had recourse to M. de Tréville, who made some advances on their pay. But these advances could not go far with 3 musketeers who were already much in arrears, and a guardsman who as yet had no pay at all. At length, when they found they were likely to be really in want, they got together, as a last effort, 8 or 10 pistoles, with which Porthos went to the gambling table. Unfortunately, he was in a bad vein. He lost all, together with 25 pistoles for which he had given his word. Then the inconvenience became distress. The hungry friends, followed by their lackeys, were seen haunting the quays and guard-rooms, picking up among their friends abroad all the dinners they could meet with, for according to the advice of Aramis, it was prudent to sow repasts right and left in prosperity, in order to reap a few in time of need. Athos was invited 4 times, and each time took his friends and their lackeys with him. Porthos had 6 occasions, and contrived in the same manner that his friends should partake of them. Aramis had 8 of them. He was a man, as must have been already perceived, who made but little noise, and yet was much sought after. As to D'Artagnan, who as yet knew nobody in the capital, he only found 1 chocolate breakfast at the house of a priest of his own province, and 1 dinner at the house of a cornet of the guards. He took his army to the priests, where they devoured as much provision as would have lasted him for 2 months, and to the cornets, who performed wonders. But, as Planchet said, people do not eat once for all time, even when they eat a good deal. D'Artagnan thus felt himself humiliated in having only procured 1 meal and a half for his companions, as the breakfast at the priest's could only be counted as half a repast, in return for the feasts which Athos, Porthos, and Aramis had procured him. He fancied himself a burden to the society, forgetting in his perfectly juvenile good faith that he had fed this society for a month. And he set his mind actively to work. He reflected that this coalition of 4 young, brave, enterprising, and active men ought to have some other object than swaggering walks, fencing lessons, and practical jokes, more or less witty. In fact, 4 men such as they were, 4 men devoted to one another, from their purses to their lives, 4 men always supporting one another, never yielding, executing singly or together the resolutions formed in common, 4 arms threatening the 4 cardinal points, or turning toward a single point, must inevitably, either subterraneously, in open day, by mining, in the trench, by cunning or by force, open themselves a way toward the object they wished to attain, however well it might be defended, or however distant it may seem. The only thing that astonished D'Artagnan was that his friends had never thought of this. He was thinking by himself, and even seriously racking his brain to find a direction for this single force 4 times multiplied, with which he had no doubt, as with the lever for which Archimedes sought, they should succeed in moving the world, when someone tapped gently at his door. D'Artagnan awakened Planchet and ordered him to open it. From this phrase, D'Artagnan awakened Planchet, the reader must not suppose it was night, or that day was hardly come. No, it had just struck 4. Planchet, 2 hours before, had asked his master for some dinner, and he had answered him with the proverb, "He who sleeps dines," and Planchet dined by sleeping. A man was introduced, of simple mien, who had the appearance of a tradesman. Planchet, by way of dessert, would have liked to hear the conversation, But the citizen declared to D'Artagnan that, what he had to say being important and confidential, he desired to be left alone with him. D'Artagnan dismissed Planchet and requested his visitor to be seated. There was a moment of silence, during which the two men looked at each other as if to make a preliminary acquaintance, after which D'Artagnan bowed, as a sign that he listened. "I have heard Monsieur d'Artagnan spoken of as a very brave young man," said the citizen, "and this reputation which he justly enjoys has decided me to confide a secret to him." "Speak, monsieur, speak," said D'Artagnan, who instinctively scented something advantageous. The citizen made a fresh pause, and continued, "I have a wife who is seamstress to the Queen, monsieur, and who is not deficient in either virtue or beauty. I was induced to marry her about 3 years ago, although she had but very little dowry, because Monsieur Laporte, the Queen's cloak-bearer, is her godfather, and befriends her." "Well, monsieur?" asked D'Artagnan. "Well," resumed the citizen, "well, monsieur, my wife was abducted yesterday morning, as she was coming out of her workroom." "And by whom was your wife abducted?" "I know nothing surely, monsieur, but I suspect someone." "And who is the person whom you suspect?" "A man who has pursued her for a long time." "The devil! But allow me to tell you, monsieur," continued the citizen, "that I am convinced that there is less love than politics in all this." "Less love than politics?" replied D'Artagnan, with a reflective air. "And what do you suspect?" "I do not know whether I ought to tell you what I suspect." "Monsieur, I beg you to observe that I ask you absolutely nothing. It is you who have come to me. It is you who have told me that you had a secret to confide in me. Act, then, as you think proper. There is still time to withdraw." "No, monsieur, no, no, no. You appear to be an honest young man, and I will have confidence in you. I believe, then, that it is not on account of any intrigues of her own that my wife has been arrested, but because of those of a lady much greater than herself." Ah, can it be on account of the amours of Madame de Bois Tracy?" said D'Artagnan, wishing to have the air, in the eyes of the citizen, of being posted as to court affairs. "Higher, monsieur, higher!" "Of Madame d'Aiguillon?" "Still higher!" "Of Madame de Chevreuse?" "Of the—" D'Artagnan checked himself. "Yes, monsieur," replied the terrified citizen, in a tone so low that he was scarcely audible. "And with whom?" "With whom can it be, if not the Duke of—" "The Duke of—" "Yes, monsieur," replied the citizen, giving a still fainter intonation to his voice. "But how do you know all this?" "How do I know?" "Yes, how do you know it? No half-confidence, or— You understand?" "I know it from my wife, monsieur, from my wife herself." "Who learns it from whom?" "From Monsieur Laporte. Did I not tell you that she was the goddaughter of Monsieur Laporte, the confidential man of the Queen? Well, Monsieur Laporte placed her near her Majesty in order that our poor Queen might at least have someone in whom she could place confidence. Abandoned as she is by the king, watched as she is by the cardinal, betrayed as she is by everybody." Ah, it begins to develop itself," said D'Artagnan. "Now, my wife came home 4 days ago, monsieur. One of her conditions was that she should come home and see me twice a week, for, as I had the honor to tell you, my wife loves me dearly. My wife then came and confided to me that the Queen, at that very moment, entertained great fears. Truly. Yes, the cardinal, as it appears, pursues her and persecutes her more than ever. He cannot pardon her the history of the Sarabande. You know the history of the Sarabande? Pardieu! Know it, replied D'Artagnan, who knew nothing about it, but who wished to appear to know everything that was going on. So that now it is no longer hatred, but vengeance. Indeed. And the Queen believes... Well, what does the Queen believe? She believes that someone has written to the Duke of Buckingham in her name. In the Queen's name? Yes, to make him come to Paris. And when once come to Paris, to draw him into some snare. The devil! But your wife, monsieur, what has she to do with all this? Her devotion to the Queen is known, and they wish either to remove her from her mistress or to intimidate her in order to obtain her Majesty's secrets, or to seduce her and make use of her as a spy. That is likely, said D'Artagnan. But the man who has abducted her, do you know him? I have told you that I believe I know him. His name? I do not know that. What I do know is that he is a creature of the cardinal, his evil genius. But you have seen him. Yes, my wife pointed him out to me one day. Has he anything remarkable about him by which one may recognize him? Oh, certainly. He is a noble of very lofty carriage, black hair, swarthy complexion, piercing eye, white teeth, and has a scar on his temple. A scar on his temple, cried D'Artagnan, and with that, white teeth, a piercing eye, dark complexion, black hair, and haughty carriage. Why, that's my man of Mung. He is your man, do you say? Yes, yes, but that has nothing to do with it. No, I'm wrong. On the contrary, that simplifies the matter greatly. If your man is mine, with one blow I shall obtain 2 revenges, that's all. But where to find this man? I know not. Have you no information as to his abiding place? None. One day, as I was conveying my wife back to the Louvre, he was coming out as she was going in, and she showed him to me. The devil, murmured D'Artagnan. All this is vague enough. From whom have you learned of the abduction of your wife? From Monsieur Laporte. Did he give you any details? He knew none himself. And you have learned nothing from any other quarter? Yes, I have received... What? I fear I am committing a great imprudence. You always come back to that, but I must make you see this time that it is too late to retreat. I do not retreat. Mordieu! Cried the citizen, swearing, in order to rouse his courage. Besides, by the faith of Bonacieux... You call yourself Bonacieux? Interrupted D'Artagnan. Yes, that is my name. You said then, by the word of Bonacieux. Pardon me for interrupting you, but it appears to me that the name is familiar to me. Possibly, monsieur. I am your landlord. Ah, said D'Artagnan, half rising and bowing. You are my landlord? Yes, monsieur, yes. And as it is 3 months since you have been here, and though, distracted as you must be in your important occupations, you have forgotten to pay me my rent, as I say, I have not tormented you a single instant. I thought you would appreciate my delicacy. How can it be otherwise, my dear Bonacieux? Replied D'Artagnan. Trust me, I am fully grateful for your unparalleled conduct. And if, as I told you, I can be of any service to you... I believe you, monsieur, I believe you. And as I was about to say, by the word of Bonacieux, I have confidence in you. Finish, then, what you were about to say." The citizen took a paper from his pocket and presented it to D'Artagnan. "A letter," said the young man, "which I received this morning." D'Artagnan opened it, and as the day was beginning to decline, he approached the window to read it. The citizen followed him. "Do not seek your wife," read D'Artagnan. "She will be restored to you when there is no longer occasion for her. If you make a single step to find her, you are lost." "That's pretty positive," continued D'Artagnan. "But after all, it is but a menace." "Yes, but that menace terrifies me. I am not a fighting man at all, monsieur. I am afraid of the Bastille." Said D'Artagnan. "I have no greater regard for the Bastille than you. If it were nothing but a sword thrust, why then—" "I have counted upon you on this occasion, monsieur." "Yes?" "Seeing you constantly surrounded by musketeers of a very superb appearance, and knowing that these musketeers belonged to Monsieur de Tréville, and were consequently enemies of the cardinal, I thought that you and your friends, while rendering justice to your poor queen, would be pleased to play his eminence an ill turn." "Without doubt." "And then I have thought that considering 3 months' lodging, about which I have said nothing—" Yes, you have already given me that reason, and I find it excellent." "Reckoning still further, that as long as you do me the honor to remain in my house, I shall never speak to you about rent." "Very kind." "And adding to this, if there be need of it, meaning to offer you 50 pistoles, if, against all probability, you should be short at the present moment." "Admirable! You are rich, then, my dear Monsieur Bonacieux?" "I am comfortably off, monsieur, that is all. I have scraped together some such thing as an income of 2,000 or 3,000 crowns at the haberdashery business, but more particularly in venturing some funds in the last voyage of the celebrated navigator Jean Moquet, so that you understand, monsieur—" "But," cried the citizen. "What?" demanded D'Artagnan. "Whom do I see yonder?" "Where?" "In the street, facing the window, in the embrasure of that door. A man wrapped in a cloak." "It is he!" cried D'Artagnan and the citizen at the same time, each having recognized his man. "Ah, this time," cried D'Artagnan, springing to his sword, "this time he will not escape me." Drawing his sword from its scabbard, he rushed out of the apartment. On the staircase he met Athos and Porthos, who were coming to see him. They separated, and D'Artagnan rushed between them like a dart. "Pah! Where are you going?" cried the 2 musketeers in a breath. "The man of Meung," replied D'Artagnan, and disappeared. D'Artagnan had more than once related to his friends his adventure with the stranger, as well as the apparition of the beautiful foreigner, to whom this man had confided some important missive. The opinion of Athos was that D'Artagnan had lost his letter in the skirmish. A gentleman, in his opinion, and according to D'Artagnan's portrait of him the stranger must be a gentleman, would be incapable of the baseness of stealing a letter. Porthos saw nothing in all this but a love-meeting, given by a lady to a cavalier, or by a cavalier to a lady, which had been disturbed by the presence of D'Artagnan and his yellow horse. Aramis said that as these sorts of affairs were mysterious, it was better not to fathom them. They understood then, from the few words which escaped from D'Artagnan, what affair was in hand, and as they thought that overtaking his man or losing sight of him, D'Artagnan would return to his rooms, they kept on their way. When they entered D'Artagnan's chamber, it was empty. The landlord, dreading the consequences of the encounter which was doubtless about to take place between the young man and the stranger, had, consistent with the character he had given himself, judged it prudent to decamp. End of Chapter 8.
This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recorded by Simon Taylor. The Three Musketeers by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 9. D'Artagnan shows himself. As Athos and Porthos had foreseen, at the expiration of a half-hour, D'Artagnan returned. He had again missed his man, who had disappeared as if by enchantment. D'Artagnan had run, sword in hand, through all the neighbouring streets, but had found nobody resembling the man he sought for. Then he came back to the point where, perhaps, he ought to have begun, and that was to knock at the door against which the stranger had leaned. But this proved useless, for though he knocked 10 or 12 times in succession, no one answered, and some of the neighbours, who put their noses out of their windows or were brought to their doors by the noise, had assured him that that house, all the openings of which were tightly closed, had not been inhabited for 6 months. While D'Artagnan was running through the streets and knocking at doors, Aramis had joined his companions, so that on returning home, D'Artagnan found the reunion complete. "Well," cried the Three Musketeers all together, on seeing D'Artagnan enter with his brow covered with perspiration and his countenance upset with anger. "Well," cried he, throwing his sword upon the bed, "this man must be the devil in person. He has disappeared like a phantom, like a shade, like a spectre." "Do you believe in apparitions?" asked Athos of Porthos. "I never believe in anything I have not seen, and as I never have seen apparitions, I don't believe in them." "The Bible," said Aramis, "make our belief in them a law. The ghost of Samuel appeared to Saul, and it is an article of faith that I should be very sorry to see any doubt thrown upon Porthos." "At all events, man or devil, body or shadow, illusion or reality, this man is born for my damnation. For his flight has caused us to miss a glorious affair, gentlemen, an affair by which there were 100 pistoles, and perhaps more, to be gained." "How is that?" cried Porthos and Aramis in a breath. As to Athos, faithful to his system of reticence, he contented himself with interrogating D'Artagnan by a look. "Planchet," said D'Artagnan to his domestic, who just then insinuated his head through the half-open door in order to catch some fragments of the conversation, "go down to my landlord, Monsieur Bonacieux, and ask him to send me 6 bottles of Beaugency wine. I prefer that." Ah, you have credit with your landlord, then?" asked Porthos. "Yes," replied D'Artagnan, "from this very day. And mind, if the wine is bad, we will send him to find better." "We must use and not abuse," said Aramis sententiously. "I always said that D'Artagnan had the longest head of the 4, said Athos, who, having uttered his opinion, to which D'Artagnan replied with a bow, immediately resumed his accustomed silence. "But come, what is this about?" asked Porthos. "Yes," said Aramis, "impart it to us, my dear friend, unless the honour of any lady be hazarded by this confidence. In that case, you would do better to keep it to yourself." "Be satisfied," replied D'Artagnan. "The honour of no one will have cause to complain of what I have to tell." He then related to his friends, word for word, all that had passed between him and his host, and how the man who had abducted the wife of his worthy landlord was the same with whom he had had the difference at the hostelry of the Jolly Miller. "Your affair is not bad," said Athos, after having tasted like a connoisseur, and indicated by a nod of his head that he thought the wine good. "And one may draw 50 or 60 pistoles from this good man. Then there only remains to ascertain whether these 50 or 60 pistoles are worth the risk of 4 heads." "But observe," cried D'Artagnan, "that there is a woman in the affair, a woman carried off, a woman who is doubtless threatened, tortured perhaps, and all because she is faithful to her mistress." "Beware, D'Artagnan, beware," said Aramis. "You grow a little too warm, in my opinion, about the fate of Madame Bonacieux. Woman was created for our destruction, and it is from her we inherit all our miseries." At this speech of Aramis, the brow of Athos became clouded, and he bit his lips. "It is not Madame Bonacieux about whom I am anxious," cried D'Artagnan, "but the Queen, whom the king abandons, whom the cardinal persecutes, and who sees the heads of all her friends fall, one after the other." "But why does she love what we hate most in the world, the Spaniards and the English?" "Spain is her country," replied D'Artagnan, "and it is very natural that she should love the Spanish, who are the children of the same soil as herself. As to the second reproach, I have heard it said that she does not love the English, but an Englishman." "Well, and by my faith," said Athos, "it must be acknowledged that this Englishman is worthy of being loved. I never saw a man with a nobler air than his." "Without reckoning that he dresses as nobody else can," said Porthos. "I was at the Louvre on the day when he scattered his pearls, and, pardieu, I picked up 2 that I sold for 10 pistoles each. Do you know him, Aramis?" "As well as you do, gentlemen, for I was among those who seized him in the garden at Amiens, into which Monsieur Poutange, the Queen's equerry, introduced me. I was at school at the time, and the adventure appeared to me to be cruel for the king." "Which would not prevent me," said D'Artagnan, "if I knew where the Duke of Buckingham was, from taking him by the hand and conducting him to the Queen, were it only to enrage the cardinal, and if we could find means to play him a sharp turn, I vow that I would voluntarily risk my head in doing it." "And did the mercer," rejoined Athos, "tell you, D'Artagnan, that the Queen thought that Buckingham had been brought over by a forged letter?" "She is afraid so." "Wait a minute, then," said Aramis. "What for?" demanded Porthos. "Go on, while I endeavour to recall circumstances." "And now I am convinced," said D'Artagnan, "that this abduction of the Queen's woman is connected with the events of which we are speaking, and perhaps with the presence of Buckingham in Paris." "The Gascon is full of ideas," said Porthos with admiration. "I like to hear him talk," said Athos. "His dialect amuses me." "Gentlemen," cried Aramis, "listen to this." "Listen to Aramis," said his 3 friends. "Yesterday I was at the house of a doctor of theology, whom I sometimes consult about my studies." Athos smiled. "He resides in a quiet corner," continued Aramis. "His tastes and his profession require it. Now, at the moment when I left his house—" Here Aramis paused. "Well," cried his auditors, "at the moment you left his house?" Aramis appeared to make a strong inward effort, like a man who, in the full relation of a falsehood, finds himself stopped by some unforeseen obstacle. But the eyes of his 3 companions were fixed upon him, their ears were wide open, and there were no means of retreat. "This doctor has a niece," continued Aramis. "Ah, he has a niece," interrupted Porthos. "A very respectable lady," said Aramis. The 3 friends burst into laughter. "If you laugh, you doubt me," replied Aramis. "You shall know nothing." "We believe like Mohammedans, and are as mute as tombstones," said Athos. "I will continue, then," resumed Aramis. "This niece comes sometimes to see her uncle, and by chance was there yesterday at the same time that I was, and it was my duty to offer to conduct her to her carriage." "Ah, she has a carriage, then, this niece of the doctor," interrupted Porthos, one of whose faults was a great looseness of tongue. "A nice acquaintance, my friend." "Porthos," replied Aramis, "I have had the occasion to observe to you more than once that you are very indiscreet, and that is injurious to you among the women." "Gentlemen, gentlemen," cried D'Artagnan, who began to get a glimpse of the result of the adventure. "The thing is serious. Let us try not to jest, if we can. Go on, Aramis, go on." "All at once a tall, dark gentleman, just like yours, D'Artagnan." "The same, perhaps," said he. "Possibly," continued Aramis, "came toward me, accompanied by 5 or 6 men, who followed about 10 paces behind him, and in the politest tone Monsieur Duke, said he to me. And you, madame, continued he, addressing the lady on my arm. The doctor's niece. Hold your tongue, Porthos, said Athos. You are insupportable. Will you enter this carriage, and that without offering the least resistance, without making the least noise? He took you for Buckingham, cried D'Artagnan. I believe so, replied Aramis. But the lady? Asked Porthos. He took her for the Queen, said D'Artagnan. Just so, replied Aramis. The Gascon is the devil, cried Athos. Nothing escapes him. The fact is, said Porthos, Aramis is of the same height and something of the shape of the Duke, but it nevertheless appears to me that the dress of a musketeer— I wore an enormous cloak, said Aramis. In the month of July? The devil, said Porthos. Is the doctor afraid that you may be recognized? I can comprehend that the spy may have been deceived by the person, but the face— I had a large hat, said Aramis. Oh, good Lord, cried Porthos, what precautions for the study of theology! Gentlemen, said D'Artagnan, do not let us lose our time in jesting. Let us separate, and let us seek the mercer's wife. That is the key of the intrigue. A woman of such inferior condition, can you believe so? Said Porthos, protruding his lips with contempt. She is goddaughter to Laporte, the confidential valet of the Queen. Have I not told you so, gentlemen? Besides, it has perhaps been her Majesty's calculation to seek on this occasion for support so lowly. High heads expose themselves from afar, and the cardinal is long-sighted. Well, said Porthos, in the first place make a bargain with the mercer, and a good bargain. That's useless, said D'Artagnan, for I believe if he does not pay us, we shall be well enough paid by another party. At this moment, a sudden noise of footsteps was heard upon the stairs. The door was thrown violently open, and the unfortunate mercer rushed into the chamber in which the council was held. "Save me, gentlemen, for the love of heaven, save me!" cried he. "There are 4 men come to arrest me! Save me! Save me!" Porthos and Aramis arose. "A moment!" cried D'Artagnan, making them a sign to replace in the scabbard their half-drawn swords. "It is not courage that is needed, it is prudence." "And yet," cried Porthos, "we will not leave." "You will leave D'Artagnan to act as he thinks proper," said Athos. "He has, I repeat, the longest head of the 4, and for my part, I declare that I will obey him. Do as you think best, D'Artagnan." At this moment the 4 guards appeared at the door of the antechamber, but seeing 4 musketeers standing and their swords by their sides, they hesitated about going further. "Come in, gentlemen, come in," called D'Artagnan. "You are here in my apartment, and we are all faithful servants of the king and cardinal." "Then, gentlemen, you will not oppose our executing the orders we have received?" asked one, who appeared to be the leader of the party. "On the contrary, gentlemen, we would assist you if it were necessary." "What does he say?" grumbled Porthos. "You are a simpleton," said Athos. "Silence!" "But you promised me," whispered the poor mercer. "We can only save you by being free ourselves," replied D'Artagnan in a rapid, low tone. "And if we appear inclined to defend you, they will arrest us with you." "It seems, nevertheless—" "Come, gentlemen, come," said D'Artagnan aloud. "I have no motive for defending Monsieur. I saw him today for the first time, and he can tell you on what occasion. He came to demand the rent of my lodging. Is that not true, Monsieur Bonacieux? Answer." "It is the very truth," cried the mercer. "But Monsieur does not tell you—" "Silence! With respect to me, silence. With respect to my friends, silence about the Queen above all, or you will ruin everybody without saving yourself. Come, come, gentlemen, remove the fellow." And D'Artagnan pushed the half-stupefied mercer among the guards, saying to him, "You are a shabby old fellow, my dear. You come to demand money of me, of a musketeer. To prison with him. Gentlemen, once more, take him to prison and keep him under key as long as possible. That will give me time to pay him." The officers were full of thanks and took away their prey. As they were going down, D'Artagnan laid his hand on the shoulder of their leader. "May I not drink to your health and you to mine?" said D'Artagnan, filling 2 glasses with the Beaugency wine, which he had obtained from the liberality of Monsieur Bonacieux. "That will do me great honour," said the leader of the posse, "and I accept thankfully." "Then to yours, monsieur. What is your name?" "Beaurenard." "Monsieur Beaurenard." "To yours, my gentleman. What is your name in your turn, if you please?" "D'Artagnan." To yours, monsieur." "And above all others," cried D'Artagnan, as if carried away by his enthusiasm, "to that of the king and the cardinal." The leader of the posse would perhaps have doubted the sincerity of D'Artagnan if the wine had been bad, but the wine was good, and he was convinced. "What diabolical villainy you've performed here," said Porthos, when the officer had rejoined his companions, and the four friends found themselves alone. "Shame, shame for 4 Musketeers to allow an unfortunate fellow who cried for help to be arrested in their midst, and a gentleman to hobnob with a bailiff." "Porthos," said Aramis, "Athos has already told you that you are a simpleton, and I am quite of his opinion. D'Artagnan, you are a great man, and when you occupy Monsieur de Tréville's place, I will come and ask your influence to secure me an abbey." "Well, I am in a maze," said Porthos. "Do you approve of what D'Artagnan has done?" "Parbleu! Indeed I do," said Athos. "I not only approve of what he has done, but I congratulate him upon it." "And now, gentlemen," said D'Artagnan, without stopping to explain his conduct to Porthos, "all for one, one for all. That is our motto, is it not?" "And yet," said Porthos. "Hold out your hand and swear," cried Athos and Aramis at once. Overcome by example, grumbling to himself, nevertheless Porthos stretched out his hand, and the four friends repeated with one voice the formula dictated by D'Artagnan. "All for one! One for all!" "That's well. Now let us every one retire to his own home," said D'Artagnan, as if he had done nothing but command all his life. "And attention, for from this moment we are at feud with the cardinal." End of chapter 9.
This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by Meredith Hughes, Cambridge, Massachusetts. The Three Musketeers by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 10. A Mousetrap in the 17th Century. The invention of the mousetrap does not date from our days. As soon as societies, in forming, had invented any kind of police, that police invented mousetraps. As perhaps our readers are not familiar with the slang of the Rue de Jerusalem, and as it is 15 years since we applied this word for the first time to this thing, allow us to explain to them what is a mousetrap. When in a house, of whatever kind it may be, an individual suspected of any crime is arrested, the arrest is held secret. 4 or 5 men are placed in an ambuscade in the front room. The door is opened to all who knock. It is closed after them, and they are arrested, so that at the end of 2 or 3 days they have in their power almost all the habitués of the establishment. And that is a mousetrap. The apartment of Monsieur Bonacieux, then, became a mousetrap, and whoever appeared there was taken and interrogated by the cardinal's people. It must be observed that as a separate passage led to the first floor in which D'Artagnan lodged, those who called on him were exempted from this detention. Besides, nobody came thither but the 3 Musketeers. They had all been engaged in earnest search and inquiries, but had discovered nothing. Athos had even gone so far as to question Monsieur de Tréville, a thing which, considering the habitual reticence of the worthy Musketeer, had very much astonished his captain. But Monsieur de Tréville knew nothing, except that the last time he had seen the cardinal, the king, and the queen, the cardinal looked very thoughtful, the king uneasy, and the redness of the queen's eyes denoted that she had been sleepless or tearful. But this last circumstance was not striking, as the queen, since her marriage, had slept badly and wept much. Monsieur de Tréville requested Athos, whatever might happen, to be observant of his duty to the king, but particularly to the queen, begging him to convey his desires to his comrades. As to D'Artagnan, he did not budge from his apartment. He converted his chamber into an observatory. From his windows he saw all the visitors who were caught. Then, having removed a plank from his floor, and nothing much remaining but a simple ceiling between him and the room beneath in which the interrogatories were made, he heard all that passed between the inquisitors and the accused. The interrogatories, preceded by a minute search operated upon the persons arrested, were almost always framed thus: Has Madame Bonacieux sent anything to you for her husband or any other person? Has Monsieur Bonacieux sent anything to you for his wife or for any other person? Has either of them confided anything to you by word of mouth?" "If they knew anything, they would not question people in this manner," said D'Artagnan to himself. "Now, what is it they want to know? Why, they want to know if the Duke of Buckingham is in Paris, and if he has had or is likely to have an interview with the queen." D'Artagnan held on to this idea, which, from what he had heard, was not wanting in probability. In the meantime, the mousetrap continued in operation, and likewise D'Artagnan's vigilance. On the evening of the day after the arrest of poor Bonacieux, as Athos had just left D'Artagnan to report at Monsieur de Tréville's, and as 9 o'clock had just struck, and as Planchet, who had not yet made the bed, was beginning his task, a knocking was heard at the street door. The door was instantly opened and shut. Someone was taken in the mousetrap. D'Artagnan flew to his hole, laid himself down on the floor at full length, and listened. Cries were soon heard, and then moans, which someone appeared to be endeavoring to stifle. There were no questions. "The devil!" said D'Artagnan to himself. "It seems like a woman. They search her, she resists, they use force. The scoundrels!" In spite of his prudence, D'Artagnan restrained himself with great difficulty from taking a part in the scene that was going on below. "But I tell you that I am the mistress of this house, gentlemen. I tell you I am Madame Bonacieux. I tell you I belong to the queen," cried the unfortunate woman. "Madame Bonacieux," murmured D'Artagnan. "Can I be so lucky as to find what everybody is seeking for?" The voice became more and more indistinct. A tumultuous movement shook the partition. The victim resisted as much as a woman could resist 4 men. "Pardon, gentlemen, murmured the voice, which could now only be heard in inarticulate sounds. "They are binding her. They are going to drag her away!" cried D'Artagnan to himself, springing up from the floor. "My sword! Good, it is by my side. Planchet!" "Monsieur?" "Run and seek Athos, Porthos, and Aramis. One of the 3 will certainly be at home, perhaps all 3. Tell them to take arms, to come here, and to run. Ah, I remember, Athos is at Monsieur de Tréville's." "But where are you going, monsieur? Where are you going?" "I am going down by the window, in order to be there the sooner," cried D'Artagnan. "You put back the boards, sweep the floor, go out at the door, and run as I told you." "Oh, monsieur, monsieur, you will kill yourself!" cried Planchet. "Hold your tongue, stupid fellow," said D'Artagnan, and laying hold of the casement, he let himself gently down from the first story, which fortunately was not very elevated, without doing himself the slightest injury. He then went straight to the door and knocked, murmuring, "I will go myself and be caught in the mousetrap, but woe be to the cats that shall pounce upon such a mouse." The knocker had scarcely sounded under the hand of the young man before the tumult ceased, steps approached, the door was opened, and D'Artagnan, sword in hand, rushed into the rooms of Monsieur Bonacieux, the door of which, doubtless acted upon by a spring, closed after him. Then those who dwelt in Bonacieux's unfortunate house, together with the nearest neighbors, heard loud cries, stamping of feet, clashing of swords, and breaking of furniture. A moment after, those who, surprised by this tumult, had gone to their windows to learn the cause of it, saw the door open, and 4 men, clothed in black, not come out of it, but fly, like so many frightened crows, leaving on the ground and on the corners of the furniture feathers from their wings, that is to say, patches of their clothes and fragment of their cloaks. D'Artagnan was conqueror. Without much effort, it must be confessed, for only one of the officers was armed, and even he defended himself for form's sake. It is true that the 3 others had endeavored to knock the young man down with chairs, stools, and crockery, but 2 or 3 scratches made by Gascon's blade terrified them. 10 minutes sufficed for their defeat, and D'Artagnan remained master of the field of battle. The neighbors who had opened their windows, with the coolness particular to the inhabitants of Paris in these times of perpetual riots and disturbances, closed them again as soon as they saw the 4 men in black flee, their instinct telling them that for the time all was over. Besides, it began to grow late, and then, as today, people went to bed early in the quarter of Luxembourg. On being left alone with Madame Bonacieux, D'Artagnan turned toward her. The poor woman reclined where she had been left, half fainting upon an armchair. D'Artagnan examined her with a rapid glance. She was a charming woman of 25 or 26 years, with dark hair, blue eyes, and a nose slightly turned up, admirable teeth, and a complexion marbled with rose and opal. There, however, ended the signs which might have confounded her with a lady of rank. The hands were white, but without delicacy. The feet did not bespeak the woman of quality. Happily, D'Artagnan was not yet acquainted with such niceties. While D'Artagnan was examining Mme. Bonacieux, and was, as we have said, close to her, he saw on the ground a fine cambric handkerchief, which he picked up, as was his habit, and at the corner of which he recognized the same cipher he had seen on the handkerchief which had nearly caused him and Aramis to cut each other's throat. From that time D'Artagnan had been cautious with respect to handkerchiefs with arms on them, and he therefore placed in the pocket of Mme. Bonacieux the one he had just picked up. At that moment Mme. Bonacieux recovered her senses. She opened her eyes, looked around her with terror, saw that the apartment was empty and that she was alone with her liberator. She extended her hands to him with a smile. Mme. Bonacieux had the sweetest smile in the world. "Ah, monsieur," said she, "you have saved me. Permit me to thank you." "Madame," said D'Artagnan, "I have only done what every gentleman would have done in my place. You owe me no thanks." "Oh, yes, monsieur, oh, yes, and I hope to prove to you that you have not served an ingrate. But what could these men, whom I at first took for robbers, want with me? And why is Monsieur Bonacieux not here?" "Madame, these men were more dangerous than any robbers could have been, for they are the agents of the cardinal. And as to your husband, Monsieur Bonacieux, he is not here because he was yesterday evening conducted to the Bastille." "My husband in the Bastille!" cried Mme. Bonacieux. "Oh, my God, what has he done? Poor dear man, he is innocence itself!" And something like a faint smile lighted the still terrified features of the young woman. "What has he done, madame?" said D'Artagnan. "I believe that his only crime is to have at the same time the good fortune and the misfortune to be your husband." "But, monsieur, you know, then—" "I know that you have been abducted, madame." "And by whom? Do you know him? Oh, if you know him, tell me!" "By a man of from 40 to 45 years, with black hair, a dark complexion, and a scar on his left temple." "That is he, that is he. But his name?" "Ah, his name, I do not know that." "And did my husband know I had been carried off?" "He was informed of it by a letter, written to him by the abductor himself." "And does he suspect," said Mme. Bonacieux with some embarrassment, "the cause of this event?" "He attributed it, I believe, to a political cause." "I doubted from the first, and now I think entirely as he does. Then my dear Monsieur Bonacieux has not suspected me a single instant?" "So far from it, madame, he was too proud of your prudence, and above all, of your love." A second smile, almost imperceptible, stole over the rosy lips of the pretty young woman. "But," continued D'Artagnan, "how did you escape?" "I took advantage of a moment when they left me alone, and as I had known since morning the reason of my abduction, with the help of the sheets I let myself down from the window. Then, as I believed my husband would be at home, I hastened hither." "To place yourself under his protection?" "Oh, no, poor dear man! I knew very well that he was incapable of defending me, but as he could serve us in other ways, I wished to inform him." "Of what?" "Oh, that is not my secret. I must not, therefore, tell you." "Besides," said D'Artagnan, "pardon me, madame, if, guardsman as I am, I remind you of prudence. Besides, I believe we are not here in a very proper place for imparting confidences. The men I have put to flight will return reinforced. If they find us here, we are lost. I have sent for 3 of my friends, but who knows whether they were at home?" "Yes, yes, you are right," cried the affrighted Mme. Bonacieux. "Let us fly! Let us save ourselves!" At these words she passed her arm under that of D'Artagnan, and urged him forward eagerly. "But whither shall we fly? Whither escape?" "Let us first withdraw from this house. Afterward we shall see." The young man and the young woman, without taking the trouble to shut the door after them, descended into the Rue des Fossoyeurs rapidly, turned into the Rue des Fossés Monsieur le Prince, and did not stop till they came to the Place Saint-Sulpice. "And now what are we to do, and where do you wish me to conduct you?" asked D'Artagnan. "I am quite at a loss how to answer you, I admit," said Mme. Bonacieux. "My intention was to inform Monsieur Laporte, through my husband, in order that Monsieur Laporte might tell us precisely what had taken place at the Louvre in the last 3 days, and whether there is any danger in presenting myself there." "But I," said D'Artagnan, "can go and inform Monsieur Laporte." "No doubt you could, only there is one misfortune, and that is that Monsieur Bonacieux is known at the Louvre, and would be allowed to pass, whereas you are not known there, and the gate would be closed against you." "Ah, bah!" said D'Artagnan. "You have at some wicket of the Louvre a concierge who is devoted to you, and who, thanks to a password, would—" Mme. Bonacieux looked earnestly at the young man. "And if I give you this password," said she, "would you forget it as soon as you used it?" "By my honor, by the faith of a gentleman," said D'Artagnan, with an accent so truthful that no one could mistake it. "Then I believe you. You appear to be a brave young man. Besides, your fortune may perhaps be the result of your devotedness." "I will do, without a promise and voluntarily, all that I can do to serve the king and be agreeable to the queen. Dispose of me, then, as a friend." "But where shall I go meanwhile?" "Is there nobody from whose house Monsieur Laporte can come and fetch you?" "No, I can trust nobody." "Stop," said D'Artagnan, "we are near Athos's door. Yes, here it is." "Who is this Athos?" "One of my friends." "But if he should be at home and see me—" "He is not at home, and I will carry away the key, after having placed you in his apartment." "But if he should return?" "Oh, he won't return, and if he should, he will be told that I have brought a woman with me, and that woman is in his apartment." "But that will compromise me sadly, you know." "Of what consequence? Nobody knows you. Besides, we are in a situation to overlook ceremony." "Come, then, let us go to your friend's house. Where does he live?" "Rue Férou, 2 steps from here." "Let us go." Both resumed their way. As D'Artagnan had foreseen, Athos was not within. He took the key, which was customarily given him as one of the family, ascended the stairs, and introduced Mme. Bonacieux into the little apartment of which we have given a description. "You are at home," said he. "Remain here, fasten the door inside, and open it to nobody unless you hear 3 taps like this," and he tapped thrice, 2 taps close together and pretty hard, the other after an interval, and lighter. "That is well," said Mme. Bonacieux. "Now, in my turn, let me give you my instructions." "I am all attention." "Present yourself at the wicket of the Louvre on the side of the Rue de l'Echelle, and ask for Germain." "Well, and then?" "He will ask you what you want, and you will answer by these 2 words, Tours and Brussels. He will at once put himself at your orders." "And what shall I command him?" "To go and fetch Monsieur Laporte, the queen's valet de chambre." "And when he shall have informed him and Monsieur Laporte is come—" "You will send him to me." "That is well. But where and how shall I see you again?" "Do you wish to see me again?" "Certainly." "Well, let that care be mine, and be at ease." "I depend upon your word." "You may." D'Artagnan bowed to Mme. Bonacieux, darting at her the most loving glance that he could possibly concentrate upon her charming little person, and while he descended the stairs he heard the door closed and double-locked. In 2 bounds he was at the Louvre. As he entered the wicket of l'Echelle, 10 o'clock struck. All the events we have described had taken place within a half-hour. Everything fell out as Mme. Bonacieux prophesied. On hearing the password, Germain bowed. In a few minutes, Laporte was at the lodge. In 2 words D'Artagnan informed him where Mme. Bonacieux was. Laporte assured himself, by having it twice repeated, of the accurate address, and set off at a run. Hardly, however, had he taken 10 steps before he returned. "Young man," said he to D'Artagnan, "a suggestion." "What?" "You may get into trouble by what has taken place." "You believe so?" "Yes. Have you any friend whose clock is too slow?" "Well?" "Go and call upon him in order that he may give evidence of your having been with him at 9:30. In a court of justice, that is called an alibi." D'Artagnan found his advice prudent. He took to his heels and was soon at M. de Tréville's, but instead of going into the saloon with the rest of the crowd, he asked to be introduced to M. de Tréville's office. As D'Artagnan so constantly frequented the hôtel, no difficulty was made in complying with his request, and a servant went to inform M. de Tréville that his young compatriot, having something important to communicate, solicited a private audience. 5 minutes after, M. de Tréville was asking D'Artagnan what he could do to serve him, and what caused his visit at so late an hour. "Pardon me, monsieur," said D'Artagnan, who had profited by the moment he had been left alone to put back M. de Tréville's clock 3/4 of an hour. "But I thought, as it was yet only 25 minutes past 9, it was not too late to wait upon you." "25 minutes past 9!" cried M. de Tréville, looking at the clock. "Why, that's impossible." "Look rather, monsieur," said D'Artagnan. "The clock shows it." "That's true," said M. de Tréville. "I believed it later. But what can I do for you?" Then D'Artagnan told M. de Tréville a long history about the queen. He expressed to him the fears he entertained with respect to her Majesty. He related to him what he had heard of the projects of the cardinal with regard to Buckingham, and all with a tranquillity and candor of which M. de Tréville was more the dupe, from having himself, as we had said, observed something fresh between the cardinal, the king, and the queen. As 10 o'clock was striking, D'Artagnan left M. de Tréville, who thanked him for his information, recommended him to have the service of the king and queen always at heart, and returned to the saloon. But at the foot of the stairs, D'Artagnan remembered he had forgotten his cane. He consequently sprang up again, re-entered the office, with a turn of his finger set the clock right again, that it might not be perceived the next day that it had been put wrong, and certain from that time that he had a witness to prove his alibi, he ran downstairs, and soon found himself in the street. End of chapter 10.